tutorial, I'm just going to talk about the different tricks and techniques that we'll be using on the course. Now, you mustn't get carried away by tricks and techniques. You know, just putting lots of different techniques into a picture doesn't necessarily make a good piece of work, but they do help, and there are just a couple that we will use a lot of, and it certainly takes the hard work out of painting the sea. Now, I've just painted that square there. I'm just going to let that dry for a minute because that's just to show you something in a little while. The first thing is to show you what cling film does, because cling film gives you a fantastic pattern of the water, and it takes the hard work out of actually painting water. I can just show you a little, this is just a little test that I did, and it gives you this lovely pattern here and here. So let's just have a go at that. Now, you have to use cling film or plastic wrap, as they call it in America, but I have a love-hate relationship with this for a couple of reasons. First, it's single-use plastic, which is not good these days, so I do try to reuse it. I try to take it off, give it a wipe, let it dry flat and use it again. And the other thing is, it's just such a nightmare to get off the roll, so get your cling film ready first, because once you've painted your square or you've put your paint on, what you don't want to be doing is having a battle with your cling film while your paint's drying. So just get yourself a little piece. You're not going to need much for this. I just should suggest you do a nice sheet of different techniques so that you'll see what they do. I've just used cobalt blue. You can use any colour really, but I'm just going to use cobalt blue, and I'm going to paint a square. Now, the paint needs to be wet. You can't just walk away there and answer the phone or whatever. You need to stick with it because you need your paint to be wet to be able to put the cling film on. So once you've got a nice wet wash like that, then now there's different ways you can put your cling film on, and I'll talk about that when we're doing the actual piece of work. If you want, if you want a linear effect where the actual shape of the wave, say the wave is sweeping up, then make it like that. Whatever pattern you see here is how your paint will dry. So if you want it to be more linear, then make it like that, and you can pick it up and you can move it about. You can see how that's beginning to do that now. Or you might just want it to be scrumpled. You basically put it on and give it a little bit of a move about. Don't squash it too flat. You want it to squash it flat some places because you can see very dark lines there, but you can see where if it's not quite touching the paper in places, you'll get these light lines. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that on there, and so you can pick it up and move it if it's not quite right. And that's all you have to do with cling film, but then you have to leave it for a good half an hour, if not longer. So that's your cling film effect. Then you need to do a salt effect. Now, salt will give you this sort of pattern here. It's great for frost, things like that, or if you're doing lichen on a tree, that sort of pattern, it's brilliant if you were doing it in greens. So the way you do this is sometimes a little bit tricky, and it can be a little bit hit and miss. Sometimes it works fabulously, and other times, I don't know, for whatever reason, it doesn't always work. But don't worry about it on the real thing, because if it doesn't work as it should, then we can still get little white marks and splashes by just spattering it at the end with some white paint, which I'm going to show you. Now, the secret of this is when to put it on. If I put that on now, it would be too wet and it wouldn't do anything at all. If you leave it until it's too dry, then it won't do anything at all either. You have to have it when it's just beginning to lose its shine. So I'm just going to leave that for a minute and get back to you, and then I'll show you what I'm going to do. Now, I've put some salt in this middle area because this middle area was actually drying quicker than the edges, which is unusual. It's normally the other way around, but the edges are beginning to just They haven't lost the shine, but I can tell that within, you know, a minute or so they will have done. And I've just got a little bit in my hand. You know, I put this, there is a handout in the resources that you can actually print out to remind you of all of this, but I have put in there, you're not salting your chips, okay? It's just little bits, sprinkle. And we need to leave that, and it doesn't actually work straight away. So I'll get rid of that, and that can just be doing its thing while I move on to something else. Now, something you will hear me say a lot is wet on wet, because I paint with wet on wet technique all the time. And the way you do that is you literally just wet your paper with clear water, and then you drop paint into it, and you can see what's happening. It's spreading, and on occasions I'll ask you to tip it and let them run together, you know, let two colours run together. You can almost see how that would work really well for water already. So that's wet in wet. And then the opposite of that is to paint wet on dry, and it's just exactly as it sounds. You're just painting on dry paper. You know, so there might be occasions when we want to just leave little waves, and we just leave the paper. Now you can see that grease mark there, that's probably a thumbprint, so you have to be really careful with your paper, because if it gets any oil or greasy material on there, then it's not going to adhere properly. So I must have handled that, because this is just a rough sheet that I have in a drawer. So that's wet on dry, and that's wet on wet. Then we need to do something called dry brushing. Dry brushing is really useful if you want to get twinkles on water. And it is easy, but you've not got to be scared of it. And dry brushing can only really be effective on paper that's got a texture on it. So if it's on knot surface, you will be okay. And if it's on a rough paper, you'll be okay. But if it's on hot press, i.e. smooth, then you won't be able to do it to the same success at all. Because basically what it does is if you can imagine having your paintbrush flat and then picking it up and keeping your fingers away from the bottom, we're going to just drag our paint across. So because this has got a texture on it, let's just think of it as hills and valleys. The paint is just going to skim the tops of the hills and leave the valleys clear. So you just get some paint on your brush, not too much, take a bit off, hence the term dry brush. You know, scrape a lot of that off, and then keep it flat, keep your fingers away from the bottom, and then just skim. And when we're doing that, it's always good to come from the side, so that if you do make a blob there, let's just, you know, say you have put too much paint on, the blob's going to be there, and then as you drag in, you know, you could always cut that section off. But that just gives you a beautiful effect of twinkles and bits of texture on water. So that's what they call dry brushing. Lifting off, we've already talked about. Now this is working just a little bit, the salt here, but not a great lot that you can see at the moment. We'll just give it a bit longer. Lifting off, we've talked about this in our colour chart and exercise, but we will be doing a lot of this, so we'll be taking big areas out, and we'll use an ordinary brush and also a little stiff bristle brush. Because the paper's actually quite robust, you can actually give it a good scrub without it ripping, as long as you're using good quality watercolour paper. If you're using something from one of these bargain shops, then you won't have the same success at all. So you can see how that would be very effective for spray of the waves. And if you don't scrub quite so hard, you know, you don't take quite so much off. And sometimes you don't even need to dab it, you just need to just move the paint around a little bit and let that dry. So that's how we lift off. Then we can actually scratch little twinkles on as well. So you've got this where you're actually dry brushing, but then we can also, with a craft knife, scratch through a dry wash. It's got to be bone dry. And then you use a craft knife, not a rounded one. I think these are 10A. You need one with a point. And then you quite hard. And you hear that I'm really scraping that. Now the thing with this, you're probably going to guess what I'm going to say, it's permanent. We're damaging the paper here on purpose. So if you painted over that now, what they call the size of this paper, which is like, it's a bit like a paste, almost like a wallpaper paste type substance that is put over the top of the paper, which stops all your paint soaking in like blotting paper. But as soon as you do that, you've actually gone through the size and you've damaged the paper. And if you painted on that now, it would just sink in like blotting paper. So this has to be one of the last things that we do. Another thing that's really good to know is that as well as salt, as I say, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It is working there, but it's probably too small for the camera to pick up. Another way of getting little white dots is to drop water or spray on a damp wash, just with clear water. So if I just get a wash here first of all, and then just leave that for a minute or two. Okay, so I've let that dry a little bit, and then you just drop little bits of water in there, or you can even spray, and you will see that the water will push the paint out of the way and you will get these little dots. Can you see how the salt is working here now? So there are different ways to get like different shaped dots. With the salt you can experiment with rock salt, salt flakes, but this is just, you know, your ordinary table salt here. So there are different ways to get these little white marks, including the scratching out, including the dry brushing, salt, and dropping clear water into a damp wash. But if these don't work as well as you'd hoped, you can always spatter. Two ways of doing that. You will need an old toothbrush and you'll need to have that damp. So just make sure you've got a lot of the water taken off there. And we need some white gouache. Now I think I've explained in my handout about gouache. Gouache is similar to watercolour, but then it's got almost like a chalky solution, or a chalky substance, sorry, added to it, which makes it opaque. So all gouache range will be an opaque effect really, which will give you a poster sort of colour that you know you're probably used to. Maybe you use those at schools. I know we certainly did. And this is brilliant because then you want something opaque that's going to just stay and not just sink into your picture. And when we spatter with white at the end, we want those white, the spray and all the little dots to be visible. So you need a tube of permanent white gouache. And then you do need to add water to it. Like this. Until you get like a nice single cream consistency. Now, seeing as I've got a paint on my brush there, I might as well use this technique first. And this is why I did this square. Remember, the bigger the brush, the bigger the dot. So if I use this number 6, and then you can use anything, and basically you're going to be knocking the brush and you will get little dots. You will get it up your arm, you will get it all over your glasses. It will wash out though, so just be careful unless you use white acrylic ink, which I do sometimes, because actually this is a little bit brighter. Sometimes this can dry a little bit grey, so I do like to use ink on occasions, but that's permanent, so use old clothes when you're doing this. Let's just see if we can get a bigger dot there using a bigger brush. Okay, so I'm using my number 12 now. And you'll get a bigger dot. And these will take a long time to dry, you know, because they are quite raised. So you just need to walk away from that and leave it overnight probably. But for a fine spray, this is when you need your toothbrush. So you put your damp toothbrush into your gouache here. And I've seen people doing all sorts of things trying to get it onto the paper. The action is, if you imagine it like that, you put your thumb on the top and then we're going to be pulling back. Okay, so imagine I'm going to be going like that. But all you need to do is point it, do exactly the same thing, but you're pointing it to your picture. And let's just do it in this corner here. Can you see what a beautiful fine spray you get there? And then if you just keep going over and over and over it, that builds up and it becomes quite dense, but it's still a very, very fine spray. You've got more control over that. Now if there are areas where you don't want the spray, you would need to just mask it off with a bit of cling film or something like that, so that it's not going to get onto part of the painting where you don't want white spray. Okay. Finally, I talked about having a white pastel. It's got to be a soft pastel, not a chalk, sorry, not an oil pastel. It's got to be a soft pastel, but it's got to be a really good one. This is a company I use here, Unison. Just ordinary basic chalk won't give you the same effect. You can buy these individually, whereas a lot of pastels you have to buy a whole box. So even though they're quite expensive, you only need to buy the one. And then we would just use this on top of our work at the end. And this really does help. It can sort of soften little areas that you're not happy with. You can smudge it with your finger, or you can leave it as a very textural mark, like so. And I can show you I've just done some little, well, perhaps not so much on that one. I've got one here, you know, where you can put little bits of pastel on. Some of it I've actually smudged in, some I haven't. And here I've also used a pale blue one as well, but that's not necessary for this course. We just need a white one. And you can see the splatters here. So that's about it for the techniques. So we've got the cling film. Let's just take that off now. That shouldn't be too bad. Sometimes it still looks wet, but actually when you peel it up at the corner, it has dried. So you can see the beautiful pattern there. You can see what the salt is beginning to do, what the droplets of clear water into a damp wash are doing, even the little ones here that we did the spray bottle. We did the wet on dry, the wet on wet, and the dry brushing. And then finally, we've spattered with a toothbrush, we've flicked with 2 different size brushes, and we've lifted out, and we've scratched out. So what I suggest you do now is to do yourself a sheet, do all of these, and then label them. Lifting out. You know, so you might want to do individual squares, one for the spattering, one for the scratching, one for the lifting out. Once again, that then can be included in your collection recording, whether it's in a file, or you could do this bookbinding, and you will find a video about the bookbinding in the resources area. I hope you have fun with that. Just have a good old practice, because it's better to practice on these sheets, even if you do 2 or 3 sheets, than practice on your finished painting. Make the mistakes on here. Okay, I will see you in another video.